I want to talk about Lot's wife, who turns to a pillar of salt. We all know the story. It's one of the most interesting things that I speak about sometimes with the bat mitzvah girls when I teach them for the bat mitzvah program that we have here. We talk about the aftermath of the destruction of Sodom, and one of the things that we learn about is the angels who told Lot and his family that they were going to be saved from Sodom's destruction. They said to Lot and his family explicitly, Al tabeit acharecha, ve'al ta'amod b'chol hakikar. It's in Perek Yutes, Pasuk Yud Zayin. They said, do not turn around. Do not turn around and look at the destruction. Run far away and don't turn around. Now, what was the reason for that command, don't turn around? So Rashi tells us, Ata hirshata imahem, because you and your family, Lot, were really pretty lowly yourselves. You did not live exemplary lives in Sodom. Invariably, you also, got involved with the mishagas of the society around you. Uvischus Avraham ata nitzol, and you're only being saved in Avraham's merit. This is what Rashi brings. Eincha kedai liros b'pur anusam ve'ata nitzol. You're not worthy. It's not fair for you to be witness to their destruction if you really deserve that same destruction. That's not proper. It's not proper for you to be able to gloat almost and see yourself being saved and see your neighbors being destroyed. However, unfortunately, Mrs. Lot does not heed the command, and therefore in Pasuk Chavav it says, "Vatabeit ishto me'acharav vatihi netziv melach." Lot's wife turns around and she turns into a pillar of salt. Now, there are a number of ways that Lot's wife could have died by turning around. One way is for her to have gotten a heart attack and just drop dead. But that's not what happens. We see an extraordinary miracle taking place. And any time we see God doing an extraordinary miracle, instead of just letting a person die just by dying, we have to try and understand what message was being conveyed. I know that whenever you drive down to Eilat, I think the tour guide tells you, oh, there's Lot's wife. There's like this big pillar.
It's only when you drive close to Yam HaMelach.
Yeah.
When you wait a lot, you don't sleep. Depends on how you drive.
Okay, I don't remember. It's been like many years since. But I think, but I don't even know if that's true. I think that's one of those things the Ministry of Tourism tells you to tell the gullible tourists.
It's very small.
But anyway.
It's getting small already here.
Oh, okay, so maybe it's a kapara for Mrs. Love? I don't know. Okay, in any event, Rashi tells us that why was this a fitting punishment for Mrs. Lot? Because Bamelech chata'a uvemelach lakta, that she was sinned with salt, and therefore she was punished with salt. So Rashi quotes the Medrash, Omar la tini ma'at melech lo orchim halalu. Lot wanted to do hachnasas orchim to the guests. And so he said to his wife, give the guests some food and make it taste good. Give them some salt with dinner. So Amar lo, afa minhag hara hazeh ata ba'a lahanhig b'makom hazeh. So she said, how dare you, contravene the norms of our society. Norms of our society is not to welcome guests into the home. It's a terrible thing to have to welcome guests in the home. Sodom was all about shali shali v'shalach shalach. It was a society where people believed it was the ultimate society of non-compassion, right? They were the most right-wing Republicans that you can imagine. Their attitude was no welfare, no kindness, no charity, nothing. We don't believe in any kind of kindness being extended. If a person wants a meal, they should have to work for it. And that's the best thing that you can do for another person, is to force them to work for their daily bread. And it's therefore a terrible thing that you want to do, to invite people and offer them a meal that they haven't worked for properly. And that's what salt represents. Salt for Mrs. Lot represented, I will reluctantly let these people eat because I'm not going to let them starve, but you want me to give them salt as well? So this was really her whole attitude about hosting guests. And therefore salt, which represents the hospitality that she should have shown, is the way that she is punished. There, of course, has to be more to it than that. Because still, to have this unbelievable miracle, and specifically salt, what's going on. So, the Medrash actually does elaborate a little bit more. The Medrash in Bereshis Rabbah in source number 3 says, Rabbi Yitzchak Amar shechata b'melach, that she actually sinned more directly with salt, because ba'oto halayla, shebo hamalachim elot, mahi osa. That night, when the angels came to Lot's house to seek his hospitality, you know what she did? Holechet el kol shechenoteha, ve'omeret lahen tenu li melach sheyesh lanu orchim. She went to her neighbors and said, you know, can I borrow some salt? We have some guests over unexpectedly. V'hi mechavenet sheyakiru behen anshei ha'ir al kein vatihi netziv melach. And her intention was not that she really needed to borrow salt. She just wanted to speak Lashon Hara about her husband and about the guests. And she wanted everyone, she wanted to foment a mob. She was, according to the Medrash, she was really responsible for the mob scene that formed outside of Lot's house with the, you know, people with the angry pitchforks and, you know, rah, we don't let guests come. That was all because of Mrs. Lot, according to the Medrash. Had she not gone to the neighbors and said, we have guests, I need some salt for them, none of this mob scene would have taken place. But again, there's even more to it than that. Reb Tzadok HaKohen Milublin, and I don't think it's, we'll just maybe read a line or two of what he says, tells us that there's another direct connection between the pillar of salt and what actually happened to the other people of Sodom. The Torah tells us that that mob scene that formed outside of Lot's house with their angry mob with their pitchforks, they said, you know, we're going to violate your guests. Send them out to us and we'll do with them what we will. So Hashem made a miracle in order to confound the mob from attacking Lot's house and breaking down the door. The Torah says in Pasuk Yud Aleph, Esa anashim asher pesach habayis hiku basan veirim mikaton va'ad gadol. He says every single person was afflicted with blindness. Vayil'u limtso hapatach, and they were unable to find the door. Now, those last words, they were unable to find the door, doesn't necessarily mean just door. Petach means the opening. They were unable to find that opening. And if we wanted to speak more metaphorically, each of us is told, find the door to your liberation, to your freedom. And they couldn't find it. This was a very, very apt punishment to the people of Sodom, because when you think about it, a person who lives by this kind of ideology that shali, what's mine is mine, and I worked hard for it and I want to keep it, and I'm going to keep on working and be more and more ambitious to try and amass more and more wealth, more and more, I need more and more and more, is really a prisoner of that kind of ideology. And Vayilulim Tzoa Petach means they couldn't find a way out. They couldn't find a way out. They were blinded to their own being prisoners of this kind of ideology. And according to Reb Tzadok, this is directly related to why Lot's wife turned into a pillar of salt. He starts off by saying, Vatabeit ishto me'acharab, that his wife turned around to look, and he writes like this, he says, Ki tokef ha'gevura shehu kevishat ha'yetzer. He says, you know what ultimate strength to be able to conquer your yetzer hara is? Lihiyot otseim einav meiraot bira, is to be able to close your eyes and not see evil. Ulakach ri'iyah otiot yirah. And that's why the word ri'iyah, which means sight, has the same letters as the word yirah, which is fear of God. Sight, being able to use your faculty of vision, is directly related in your ability to have yirah shamayim, fear of God. If you use your faculty of sight properly, then you'll have yirah. Ri'iyah, yirah, same word. But if you don't utilize your faculty of sight properly, then you won't have yirah. And there are two ways to utilize that faculty of sight properly, both positively by looking at things that instill you with awe, and also turning away from things that will distract you from awe, that distract you. When you think about it, what was it that made Mrs. Lot turn around? When you think about it, what made Mrs. Lot turn around was this need to look back at all of the wealth that she had acquired in Sodom. She was so attached to the acquisitions of Sodom that she couldn't help herself. She couldn't help herself but turn around. And so, on the one hand, Hashem gives a message of "you're blind" to the people of Sodom, but He gives a similar message to Lot's wife. And later on, Reb Tzadok alludes to this. She couldn't overcome her great desire to utilize her eyes wrongly by looking at all of the evil that she was leaving behind. There's something in the Talmud called sodomite salt. Have you heard of that term? Melech Sodomis?
Yeah.
Melech Sodomit. Yeah. Okay, that's what we're going to talk about today. Melech Sodomit is sodomite salt. It's discussed in the Gemara in a couple of places. One is in the Gemara in Eruvin Daf Yud Zayin. The Gemara says that after you eat a meal, you're obligated to wash your hands. It's called Mayim Achronim. And the Gemara asks, why is it obligatory to wash Mayim Achronim? Because of Melech Sodomit, because of sodomite salt. It was a type of salt that actually existed in the times of the Gemara. It was a very potent form of salt, and it was very flavorful, but there was only one problem. It was so potent that if a granule of salt would get in your eyes, it could actually affect your vision. It could blind you. So the Gemara therefore says, wash your hands before you bench, so that when you leave the table, you won't rub your eyes with a granule of sodomite salt on your fingers, and you'll get yourself a terrible eye infection or cause yourself, God forbid, to go blind. So it's not a coincidence, therefore, says Reb Tzadok, that we have sodomite salt that causes blindness. The people of Sodom that were gathered around the house were stricken with blindness as a sign that they were blind to the realities of life and what the real goals of life are, because they were so consumed by their desire for wealth and the desire for material gain that they were blind to the real purpose of life. Mrs. Lot turns around to look because she's also consumed by that same greed and that same desire to retain what she's losing by fleeing from a Sodom that is being destroyed. But the reason why she turns into a pillar of salt is because sodomite salt not only has physical characteristics to blind, but that's what sodomite salt represents. It's the salt of Sodom that blinds a person's eyes. So in a sense, what Hashem was revealing to Lot and his family by turning Lot's wife into a pillar of salt is, understand that that's what sodomite salt is. It is the ingredient in life that blinds a person to the true purpose of living. And that's why your wife turned around, and that's why she's being turned into sodomite salt, because she truly was blind, just like the people that were at the doorway. And I want to tell you something interesting about Mayim Achronim. You know, if you take a look in the halachic sources about Mayim Achronim, and I thought maybe you might find this interesting, I don't know. In Siman Kuf Pei Aleph, which is in the Shulchan Aruch in Orach Chaim, it talks about the law of washing Mayim Achronim. By the way, how many of you have Mayim Achronim at your Shabbos table? I'm just curious, by a show of hands. It's maybe
When we have 3 men.
Just for the men, just for 3 men.
Everybody.
Everybody. Who does it only on Shabbos? And who doesn't do it during the week but only on Shabbos or on Yom Tov? Okay, Rak Shabbat. Okay. So there's a lot of misconception about Mayim Achronim. The Shulchan Aruch does not discuss Mayim Achronim in the context of a Shabbos meal. The Shulchan Aruch, basing itself on the Gemara, talks about the mitzvah of Mayim Achronim. Every time you have a meal with bread, you have an obligation to wash Mayim Achronim. I'll get to your questions in a minute. The Shulchan Aruch writes that Mayim Achronim Chovahu, at the beginning of the chapter on the laws of Mayim Achronim, it says that it's an obligation after your meal, before you bench, to wash Mayim Achronim. And then at the very end of that chapter, the very last law of that chapter is, however, there are some people who say that nowadays that we don't have sodomite salt, we have regular table salt, the obligation is not as pressing. Now, if you take a look at the Mishnah Berurah at the beginning of Siman Kuf Pei Aleph, we'll just read a few lines from the Mishnah Berurah here. He says, Hatam, Mayim Achronim, why is Mayim Achronim obligatory? He says, Hatam mishum shahayadayim mezuhamot hein min ha'achila. He says, because your hands are dirty. You've been eating food for the last half hour or whatever it is, and your hands get dirty over the course of the meal. Upsulot lebracha. And because your hands get dirty while you're eating, they are no longer fit to make a bracha, because you shouldn't have like greasy fingers when you're making a bracha. So that's the reason why you should wash Mayim Achronim. V'samchu chazal akra de v'hit kadishtem v'item kedoshim. That's why our sages tell us that you could even look at a pasuk in the Torah. It says, you shall sanctify yourselves and be holy. V'his kadishtem elu mayim rishonim. That when it says sanctify yourselves, that refers to washing before the meal. Sheyikadshu yedeim kodem ha'achila l'tahara mituma, to purify your hands from any ritual impurity. And v'yisem kedoshim elu mayim achronim, and to make yourselves holy, meaning prepare yourself to make a bracha with cleanliness, because cleanliness is next to godliness, right? That's why you should wash mayim achronim. It's not for ritual impurity, but rather it's for cleanliness. V'afilu l'mi she'eno mevarech ba'atzmo ela shomea latzeit mipia mevarech. He says, even if you're just listening to someone else make a bracha for benching, which you could do, you still have to wash mayim achronim. Anyway, he says, then he brings down that our sages tell us that there's the reason that's brought down by the sages is because of the concern of sodomite salt, of melech sodomis. He says that even though that reason no longer applies today, but the issue of cleanliness still applies. Then at the very end of that chapter, the Mishnah Berurah in Sivkat and Chaf Beis says as follows. There are many people, says the Shulchan Aruch, that do not practice Mayim Achronim. By the way, it's interesting to note sociologically, many people from the Yekka, the German community, do not wash Mayim Achronim. And if the reason is because of cleanliness, it would make a lot of sense. Because if you've ever been at a meal of Yekkas, they've got silverware and crystal, and everyone's got the white napkins spread out very formally, and with the fork and the knife and the multiple forks and the multiple knives and the spoons and everything is very fancy. And of course, no one would dare get a speck of food on their fingers. You would be thrown away from the table for not eating in a dignified fashion. So of course, if you're eating in such a dignified way, there's no need for Mayim Achronim, right? Because no one's going to get dirty eating at such a dignified, high-class meal, right? So that's probably the way that the reason why it evolved. That if you're eating in a very dignified way with all of the cutlery and so forth, you don't have to worry about that. But listen to what the Mishnah Berurah says. He says the reason why people have a minhag not to wash Mayim Achronim today is mipnei she'ein melech sodomis matzui beineinu, because we don't have sodomite salt. Umishum yadayim mezuhamot ein chosheshin hoel va'achshav ein makpidim l'ratzon melichluch ha'ma'achal ein ze karoi zuhama lanu. The Mishnah Berurah actually says something very interesting. He says, quoting from earlier authorities, he says, today people are not so fastidious about cleanliness. You know, if you have a little grease on your hands, you're just going to go back to the office or go back to work. No one cares. And therefore, it's not considered to be a disqualification from making a bracha. So that's the reason for the custom for not washing Mayim Achronim before you make Birkat HaMazon. However, V'das Hagra B'vi'uro, the Vilna Gaon, however, says that Tzarich Litol Gam Ha'idna. that a person still has to wash even today. He says that there still is a certain aspect of both issues, both sodomite salt, even though you don't have real sodomite salt, but even the table salt today could sometimes have a damaging effect upon if you rub it in your eyes afterwards. If you rub your eyes after a spicy meal, you could get some bad spice in your eyes. And certainly the issue of dirty hands also applies today. The Kain Kosav HaMagen Avram b'Shem HaMekubalim. And similarly, the Magen Avram writes this in the name of the Kabbalists. V'chol Adam Yizaher b'mayim achronim. That every person should, and what does the word Adam mean? Does he say Ish? Kol Adam. What does Adam mean? Every human. Women are also Adam. Okay? Should be careful with mayim achronim. V'chein hichmir ha'maharshal b'yam shel shlomo v'chein kosav b'birkei Yosef ein shem sheichmir harbe. So there are many poskim who are very machmir about mayim achronim. No distinction is drawn as to whether there's a mezumin or not. No distinction is drawn in halacha whether it's Shabbos or not. After any meal, certainly with bread, which is really what this the context of this halacha, a person should wash mayim achronim. And certainly, even a meal without bread, if you know that your hands are a little bit sticky or dirty or greasy from the meal, because let's say, you were eating fried chicken with your fingers or whatever it was, certainly you should wash your hands before you make a bracha achrona, before you bench or say some final bracha. Now, in truth, there are different 20th century poskim who address the issue of whether a woman is obligated in the same way as a man to wash mayim achronim. There is nothing in the Shulchan Aruch or in the earlier poskim that would imply any distinction whatsoever between men and women. However, Rav Vosner writes, Rav Shmuel Vosner wrote in his responsum that because this is a chumrah that was accepted based on Kabbalah, only men accepted the chumrah, and women did not generally accept the chumrah. And therefore, women rely on the basic fallback position of nowadays we don't have sodomite salt, and we're generally not worried about the small amount of food residue that may be left on our fingers. So therefore, it's not necessary for women to wash mayim achronim. So if you don't wash mayim achronim, you're okay. You're okay. Because even many men don't wash mayim achronim after the meal. But it is a bit mysterious, it is a bit nebulous, I should say, as to why there is this distinction between men and women. So at our Shabbos table, we always pass around the mayim achronim to the men and to the women, because the halacha makes really no distinction whatsoever. Either don't do it, but if you are going to do mayim achronim, you should pass it to everyone at the table, unless someone once suggested to me that men are more barbaric in their eating habits than women, and therefore men get dirtier at the dinner table or at the lunch table than women do, and that's why women don't have to wash mayim achronim, because they're more dainty and clean in the. Well, I don't know, it depends. I've seen some, but I won't go into that. But in any event, the point that I wanted to raise is that I think from a Kabbalistic perspective, although I haven't looked up the Kabbalistic sources for mayim achronim, part of what we're trying to accomplish when we wash mayim achronim is that we've just had this very lovely, delicious meal where we've allowed ourselves, especially at the Shabbos table, to indulge in all of the fineries of a delicious meal with the first course and the second course and the third course and the dessert. And we're feeling quite good about ourselves and very indulgent by the end of the meal. And the concept of Melech Sodomis is not just a chemical issue. The concept of Melech Sodomis is wash away the thing that blinds you to the true purpose of living, which is very, very often going to be prevalent on your fingernails or on your fingertips your figurative fingertips at the end of a meal when you've just indulged in all of these great things. Bring yourself back to the reality and wash off those things that are the source of blindness in life. And that's what I think really what Mayim Achronim is supposed to represent. It's supposed to remind us that if we're constantly going to be turning around to look what else is coming out of the kitchen, just like Lot's wife turned around to see what else was there, then we're clinging to that pillar of salt that Lot's wife represents. So let's wash Mayim Achronim, either in the literal sense or in the figurative sense. Yes?
So I want to ask you something. What do you think is in this time that we are living now? What do you think is the salt that don't let us see the reality?
What is the salt of today?
Yeah.
Oh, where do I start?
One thing.
I don't think it's just one thing. I mean, I think that our society is saturated with self-indulgence. I mean, what is it? I remember a commercial when I was growing up where the tagline of the commercial was, "Who said you can't have it all? Who said you can't have it all? You can have it all."
Society is too much.
What?
Society is too much. We have too much of everything. It's available. Everything is
Right,
there.
right.
The accessible.
And there's the attitude within society, and including Jewish society, which is why obesity is a problem in our community. Which is it's not enough at the wedding. You got to have, a carving station and a sushi station and this station and that station, because that's expected. That's the expected indulgence that everyone should have when they make a chassan. Yes.
Is there any basis to something I once heard, a tradition that when a bride is coming in to get married, she should not turn around? Is it any connection?
Oh, that's so interesting. I'm not familiar with that tradition.
I heard about it in connection to Lot's wife turning around.
Oh.
What she's leaving behind.
Yeah. That's right. Maybe she's supposed to show that she's completely ready to move away and enter into the next chapter of her life. It could be. Interesting. Is that in Aryeh Kaplan's book, Made in Heaven?
Mentioned it once, and the girl was told, "Do not turn around. It's like Lot's wife." I don't know. It's a tradition, or it's just a bother myself.
I don't know. Okay. Have a great day, everybody.